How many of you have had shrimp in the last month? About half, maybe. How many of you had mussels or clams? Okay. So, you know, you might not know this, but insects are the equivalent of all those things on land. There are no insects in the ocean. They're pretty much terrestrial. Some of them float on top of the ocean, but none of them actually can do the deep dive into the salt water of the ocean. They aren't built for that. And so the idea of eating insects is actually sort of like eating a shrimp. But I know most of us don't actually think of it that way. There have been just some super cool studies, and there are cultures where insects are a really critical part of their diet. And yet, almost every time we talk about eating insects, people cringe a little bit in this culture. And it's, to me, it's kind of interesting. You know, shrimp, no problem, unless you're allergic. I could eat a mussel. I could eat escargot, although some people might have a reaction to escargot. So anyway, so we have this sort of feeling about it, but in lots of places it's common. Sometimes it's even a famine food in some cultures. And so I think the idea of edible insects is really fascinating. And the way that they're using insects now as part of our agricultural food production system is super cool. And so today we have Rhys Probyn, who's come to us from the Equatorial Feeds company. And he has got a really cool background. He has a Bachelor's of Environmental Science from the University of Vermont. You said you grew up here in the Boston area?
Yep.
Yeah. And then he has a Master's of Business Administration from Texas A&M and a Master's of Environment, Technology, and Engineering from Ghent University. So he's international in his sort of perspective, and I think the Europeans have been real leaders in this area. So no doubt that time in Belgium was really important. So he's used this interest in the environment, his business background, to sort of think about how can we actually create a market for insect protein, which is actually incredibly rich in protein when you compare it to some of the other sources of protein that we might get. So it's actually very nutritious. I've had cricket chips and I found them quite yummy. So I encourage everybody, if they get a chance, to try something like that out. But I don't want to steal your thunder. I want to thank you so much for coming and looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much for having me. And thank you, everybody, for coming and spending your lunch today to talk about insects. I knew about the timing, so I tried to make sure not to have any photos of people munching down on various kind of creepy crawlies. So as Colin said, my name is Rhys. I come to you from Equatorial Feeds. We are based just outside of Woods Hole in Falmouth, Massachusetts. And our goal is to basically generate protein, actually mainly for animal feeds, from waste streams, which is one of the sort of promises that sort of edible insects has been touted about edible insects. So I've been at it for about 18 months, and I can say that some of the benefits environmentally, socially, definitely are true. Some of them, the picture's not so rosy, so I'll try to take a realistic look that hopefully doesn't deflate anybody's expectations too much about the potential for edible insects in human and animal feed chains. So I'm going to start out. We'll give a little bit of background on edible insects. I'll talk specifically about the environmental performance in a number of different ways. We'll then do a little bit on edibles for human consumption, and then we'll kind of get into my forte, which is much more on the animal feed side of things. We'll talk about the background, some opportunities, industry leaders, and regulation, which is a bit of a barrier at the moment, but things are getting better. And then we'll wrap up, and I'll give you a little bit of an overview of what the a day in the life looks like for somebody who's actually trying to start up a business based on growing insects. Entomophagy, the practice of eating insects, has been around for basically as long as we have. And there's about 1,900 different species of insects that are considered edible. And at present, there are about 2 billion people on Earth whose diets actually include insects in some way, whether it's seasonal forage or whether it's just part of something that you typically buy at the market and bring home. I thought this would be actually a good point to also point out some of the additional services that we get from insects. So obviously, they're feed for livestock. I don't know if folks have traveled through the developing world. Oftentimes, you see chickens that are just very much free range wandering down the street, and a lot of what they're eating are insects. They're pollinators, bioconverters, or in another term, decomposers. You have pests, unfortunately, but you also have pest mitigators. And in addition, you also have producers of food like honey and different products that we use like silk, shellac, and bait. As I heard somebody mention actually when we came in, this is a really hot topic right now. And so why is there so much buzz around edible insects right now? And in my research, I found news articles dating back to the mid-90s talking about how insects were going to be the next big thing and just brace for the insect revolution. But I think things really kind of got going in about 2013 when the FAO published a book about it. And basically their argument was, by 2050, we're going to have 9 billion people on Earth. And a lot of our livestock systems that we're using to feed people right now are fairly inefficient. And insects are an underutilized resource in this regard. They're nutritious. They're usually rich in protein, omega-3 fatty acids. They can be high in calcium, iron, zinc. Compared to some other livestock systems, they have a low ecological footprint. And also they represent economic opportunities in urban and peri-urban settings because of the low sort of land demand for rearing insects. So these are the sort of 5 main points when it comes to environmental performance. You've got the lower feed conversion ratio, and a lot of the argument that they put on there is that they're cold-blooded, so they don't need a lot of calories just to maintain their body heat, which this is true, but actually we'll talk in a little bit why that can also be a problem, especially if you're trying to start a business here in Massachusetts where it can be cold for half of the year. Fewer greenhouse gas emissions than most livestock systems, higher productivity per unit area, so again, small footprint. Lower ammonia emissions than most livestock. Again, there's something I can refute there slightly. And the ability to use organic side streams as a feedstock. Now, that last one in particular is a bit less applicable to insects for human consumption and a bit more on the animal feed side, but we'll kind of get into that as we go forward. Okay, so let's start with the main thing, or the first major point is feed conversion ratios. So if you're involved in animal rearing or anything like this, this is usually one of the first key indicators of how you're doing. And starting in the left-hand column, the feed conversion ratio of 10:1 for beef basically means for every kilogram of live weight that a cow puts on, it requires 10 kilograms of feed or forage for it to get there. Pork's a little bit better at 5:1. I've even seen 3:1 in some recent, more recent data. 2:1 for chicken. Tilapia, catfish, they can be down, 1.5, even 1.1. And crickets here it notes are about 1.7. The other thing that, the really interesting point that I thought the FAO pointed out in this graphic, so this data is taken from the FAO report, is the digestibility. So when you grow a cow or a chicken or a pig, you end up with a lot of bone, organs, things that you don't end up eating, that don't end up actually coming into the human food chain. So if you look at beef, for instance, your digestible animal product coming off of that cow is only about 40%. Whereas if you're looking at a cricket, it's 80%. Chicken, pork, about 55 there. So if you actually adjust the feed conversion ratios to look at, for every kilogram of edible food, how much, or of edible product that you get from your livestock, how much does it take in terms of feed? The numbers look a little bit worse, especially for cows. You're looking at about 25:1, pork 9:1. But you notice with crickets at 80% digestibility, you're still around 2:1, 2.15, 2.5, something around there. So that's fairly efficient. So if you're taking grain and whatever it is that you're going to feed to a cow, if you fed it to a cricket instead, it would go a little bit further. Now, granted, you might not be able to sell the crickets for as much, so it still might make more sense to feed it to a cow. So converting organic waste to animal protein. This, again, as I said, is something that's related more to the animal feed side of things. But I thought I would point out, this is actually the main thing that got me interested in edible insects, was how do we take waste streams, which are basically underutilized resource, and turn them back into, get them back into the food chain. And insects are an interesting way of actually creating high-quality protein by doing that. So biosolids, which can straight up be, human waste. It can be, primary or secondary effluent, solids from wastewater treatment plants. Food processing waste, spent brewery grains, all of these are examples of organic sort of side streams or waste products that can be used for culturing insects. This here on the left is a compost pile from a group that we're working with down in Falmouth. They collect from all the various restaurants in town, and we usually actually run it through our system now first before it ends up there. And on the right, that's crab processing waste from a factory outside of Boston that, barrels and barrels of this stuff pretty much 4 days a week coming out, which just goes into a composting system up in Maine right now, but there's a potential to actually grow soldier flies or other kinds of insects off of it. That's kind of an important one for the next slide, so keep that those barrels of crab waste in mind as we move forward. So in terms of the other sort of environmental performance factor, you've got greenhouse gas equivalents. So this was also taken from the FAO report where they show mealworms, crickets, locusts, fairly low. Pigs, they had a low and a high range, and then with beef cattle, notoriously their manure and parts are rife with methane. But also, so you can see mealworms, crickets do quite well. Also, in terms of ammonia, you have mealworms, crickets doing quite a lot better than pigs. The ammonia emissions from pigs are really going to come out of urine, feces, things like that are just off-gassing it to the environment. It's actually a bit surprised that poultry wasn't included in this as well. That's a huge problem down in the southern United States, where large poultry houses export a lot of ammonia into the environment. So the one caveat I wanted to give you here is this isn't universal. If you remember that crab waste I showed you on the last slide, I'm pretty sure that if I were to feed my soldier fly larvae a steady diet of crab waste or a diet that's very high in crab waste, I'll give pigs a run for their money in ammonia emissions. So you can have insect rearing facilities that are polluters. So it's all about how you do it and how you manage these things that really counts. It's just not automatically better is what I'm trying to say. So another example that they point out in the FAO report is they did life cycle analysis for greenhouse gas emissions, energy consumption, and land use. Obviously, you can see in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, you have the gray bar is the low, the green bar is the high, because usually you find a range within the literature. There's not one consensus number. So, you can see mealworms perform better in greenhouse gas emissions, but in energy use, that was actually quite high. And that's where we run into the issue of the animals might not need a lot of calories in their food to maintain their body temperature, but the environment does need to provide that heat for them to maintain body temperature. So if you're somewhere like Massachusetts, Canada, you're going to have to provide, you're going to have to be consuming energy to actually provide some of that for your insects. So again, there can be a trade-off here. In terms of land use, yeah, actually insect rearing systems are usually pretty good. You can stack vertical. It's not like with a cow, you can put them on the 3rd floor of a building and expect them to do well there. Whereas with a cricket, you can just do racks that are very, very high. So that one I think is fairly accurate. So I'm going to start on the insect, the human consumption side of things. And so the industry spotlight, the main characters that you're going to see are really crickets, mealworms, locusts, and mopane caterpillars I included here because that's already kind of a big business in southern Africa. So places like Congo, South Africa, even areas up, I think, in West Africa and Nigeria, you have mopane caterpillars, important part of the diet there already. And then for livestock feeds, you have things like black soldier flies, which we're producing down in Falmouth, house flies, and mealworms. So some of the social benefits of edible insects that have been touted in this FAO paper, the opportunity to have these mini livestock enterprises. So we all have, maybe our main job, but even if you have a small apartment or a small plot of land that you live in an urban area, you might be able to start growing mealworms or crickets or something like that in your house and generate even a little bit of income. Maybe for us in this room, that doesn't seem like it makes a big difference, but if you're living, on the edge of poverty somewhere outside of Nairobi or in other places in Africa in particular, a couple extra bucks a month can make a big difference. In developing countries in particular, traditional diets include things like palm weevils, grasshoppers, termites, caterpillars, and obviously also, you know, in a lot of these areas where, you know, food supplies are seasonal and there's actually, you do quite a bit of foraging, like you'll walk down the street and you'll grab a piece of fruit off a tree and that'll be your breakfast. You know, it sort of perpetuates access and tenure to natural capital. And it also includes women in rural economies. So in a lot of areas, I spent 3 months in Uganda last year. When it's grasshopper season, a lot of times, you know, women and children in households spend a lot of time collecting and gathering up as many grasshoppers as they can for family consumption, but also bringing those to market and selling them. In the West, these are some of the products that we're starting to see pop up for edible insects. You've got things like exo bars and grub bars, very much like a Cliff Bar. In fact, as I told Colin earlier, you know, Cliff Bar could have been putting insects in there a long time ago, and I never would have known the difference. I've eaten a number of these different bars. They're really good. You can't tell the difference between that and anything else on the market. So for me, that's a great entry point. I still struggle a little bit in eating insects myself. I'm yet to try cricket chips. I'm just a little bit not there yet. There's things like, yeah, cricket powders and fortified flour. So cricket's very, very high in protein, usually about 55 to 58%. So if you're thinking, you know, if you're one of those people who has a supplement after you go to the gym, this is maybe a viable alternative to whey or soy. Whole roasted crickets, especially flavored and unflavored. So cricket chips, you can actually get like jalapeno or sour cream and onion, all these kind of different things. So there's a lot you can do to actually start to make them palatable here in the West. And then, you know, sort of gourmet foodie options are also quite popular as well, such as, yeah, I think, well, you can see the pizza crust there. Again, I'll probably start at the top of this chart and move my way in. In terms of the development of these markets, sort of especially in the West, because in a lot of areas in Asia and in Africa and South America, you know, insects are already part of the human food chain. Here's sort of the news in the last year or so. So worldwide, they expect the edible insect market to reach about 1.53 billion by 2021. Somewhere in the next 4 or 5 years, this is supposed to happen. They expect Asia Pacific will account for about 28.9, so around 30% of this market. And, you know, obviously you can see quite a bit lower. Europe edible insect market is expected to be about $46 million by 2023. So not huge, but we're seeing growth now. And they're actually seeing compound annual growth rates that are quite encouraging for Europe and the US. So it seems like, while this has been talked about, you know, from back in the 90s, it does look to have some traction right now. And then interestingly, Exo, so you saw the snack bar on the previous slide, they raised $4 million in the first ever Series A for an insect protein startup. That's a big deal. I mean, that means that institutional investors are actually starting to pay attention to this edible insect thing. So it might not just be a fad at this point. It might actually be something that starts to attract some money. So now I want to kind of shift our focus over to livestock feeds, which may be very boring to other people. It's something that gets me very excited. Again, actually, I'll just point out the main species that we look at for animal feeds are black soldier flies. That seems to have the most traction from what I can tell in terms of really large-scale production. There's obviously houseflies and mealworms. Mealworms probably dominate the market right now in terms of they're being produced in mass. You can find them in most pet stores, so they're already out there and available. But in terms of actually starting to replace some of the main constituents in real, you know, poultry feed that goes to Purdue to produce the chicken you buy at the supermarket, I think black soldier flies are going to be the leader in that area, or house flies as well, especially potentially. So a little bit of background on animal feeds for people who aren't familiar with animal feeds. So your typical protein contents are, you know, for poultry layer feed, it's about 16% protein. For pigs, 16 to 18%, depending on the life stage. For meat birds, where you're really trying to grow a broiler chicken like you'd buy in roast, it's about 20 to 22%, sometimes a little bit higher. Tilapia, you're looking at 36 to 50%. And the reason there, I think, actually comes back to that same thing with being cold-blooded in terms of fish, because They don't need the calories so much to maintain their body temperature. In theory, their environment is providing that heat, so they just need protein that they can use to build mass. And the real key with protein is that it's made up of essential amino acids. So these are things that your body needs, but that you can't produce yourself. So you've got to get it from your diet. So your common protein constituents in food, in animal feeds, are fish meal, soybean meal, and to a lesser extent, I put in cottonseed and canola. So sort of oilseed pressed cakes will often be quite high in protein as well, so those are used as well. The thing with things like cottonseed meal is generally your inclusion rate, you really can't usually go above 10, 15% depending on what you're trying to feed, because then it starts to have anti-nutritional effects. Fish meal, that's high quality protein. It's really hard to replace that. That's really good. It's really digestible. That's bang for your buck right there. And for anybody who's not really familiar with fish meal, what it is, where it comes from, imagine you have a fishing trawler that goes out, puts out a big net, just scoops up a whole school of sardines, brings it to a factory, they cook it, they process it through a number of steps that include, pressing, dehydrating, all these things. And at the end of the day, you end up with a powder that's fairly low in moisture, and the protein content's about 65%. So, I mean, again, that's really high quality, good protein as well. The problem is, as people in this room probably know, I figure this is the environmental science, studies and science school, that's not really ecologically sustainable. You can't go out every single day and harvest the hell out of sardines and expect them to be there year after year. So it's really pretty important that we find a substitute for this. Now, it's funny, I went to college, and I'm going to date myself a little bit, right around here where we were at the top of this spike. So everybody said, look at this, we're seeing, fish meal prices are starting to incorporate the unsustainability. We're not going to be able to do this. The price is just going to go up and up and up until we can find substitutes. As you can see, it's kind of done that with a few dips. But right now we're in a weird situation where we're actually at an 8-year low in fish meal. And I think that a big part of that has to do with the fact that soybean has become a reliable alternative. So I think Europe relies mostly on soybean now for animal feed protein. And other countries tend to kind of go that route as well. So for instance, if you're in Rwanda, you're landlocked, you can't produce your own fish meal. Importing it's very expensive because it's in dollars. So you start to shift your reliance a little bit more onto soy. But that actually leads into this. So here's an example of Nigeria, and I think that this is a good opportunity for insects to actually make inroads into commercial feeds. So Nigeria, it has a population of about 182 million people. It's in West Africa, so it does actually also have quite an extensive coastline, though there is quite a bit of pollution there, unfortunately, due to they've got a lot of issues related to the oil industry, and theft of oil and things like that going on. The poverty rate, according to the World Bank, is around 46%. Per capita gross national income is around $235 a month, so a little under $3 grand per year. And if you look on the right, I've got the foreign exchange of the Nigerian naira to the US dollar. As you can see, it started to drop, and so they pegged it to the dollar, which basically artificially holds the value of the currency where it is. But I guess international pressure probably finally won them out, and they had to unpeg it and let it float again, and it dropped down. So what this means is, say the price of fish meal stays at, we'll just throw a number out, $1,000 per ton. That's in US dollars, and if you want to buy that on international markets, you have to buy that in dollars. So if your currency is just devalued by 50%, that $1,000 is now twice as expensive. So you need twice as much money to go and buy the dollars to then go and buy the fish meal. So countries like Nigeria are very interested in insects like this because their climate is conducive to growing soldier flies and a number of other species, maybe mealworms as well. And they have plenty of organic waste in country that they can use. So it actually helps to mitigate some of this foreign exchange risk, because what's actually happening to producers in Nigeria right now is based on the fact that, with the general populace having such a low income rate, they can't, with their costs increasing, they can't turn around and pass that increased cost on to consumers. The market just won't bear it. So as they increase their prices, consumers drop off. So their only choice is to get squeezed and hope things get better. And that seems to be really what's happening. And so at the workshop I attended there recently, there was a lot of interest from the feed industry to get on board with edible or with insects for animal feed sooner rather than later. And actually, here's a good example. This was an example of a farm that is feeling the pinch and trying to do something about it. So Songhai Farms is in the Niger Delta in sort of southeastern Nigeria. And the team there basically put together these sort of concrete troughs. It's not really that sophisticated or anything, but it's an integrated farm. So they have crops, they have grass cutters, which are sort of I think a giant guinea pig kind of thing. They have tilapia, or catfish rather, not tilapia, and they have poultry. So they've got a lot of organic waste coming from these various businesses that they're actually turning around. They're putting into these troughs, and every couple of days they're getting a massive, just sort of natural wild recruitment of houseflies. And so they're using this to supplement their feed. So, you know, they're not actually drying it and compounding it. They're just throwing it into the ponds as is. But here's an example of someone who's already tried to, you know, figure out a solution for their margins getting squeezed and come to the conclusion that, you know, insects have a role to play. So in terms of who are some of the pioneers in the insects for animal feed industry, you've got AgroProtein based out of South Africa. That's my, if I had to put money on one of them, that would be my choice. You've got Probyn and Bachelor out of the Netherlands. You've got Enviro Flight here in the US, Enterra in Vancouver, Insect in France, actually in Paris. Sanergy in Kenya, they're a little bit smaller scale, quite a different company actually, but worth mentioning, very cool. And in China, you have a number of state-owned enterprises actually, and I can't really name any of them because it is really tough. I don't speak Chinese, unfortunately, and it's really tough to get information out of China. Like they're fairly secretive. Even the large players that we know of are very secretive about their technology, what they're doing. But you know, some light's starting to be shed on that as they feel like they've got enough of a head start to be able to actually sort of come out. Some up-and-comers in the U.S., these are sort of some smaller companies that are growing on their own. You've got Grubly Farms out of Atlanta. They've made great strides in the last year, and they're producing right now soldier flies like us. You have Little Herds in Austin, Texas. Mad Agriculture out in Boulder, Colorado, and then you've got us, Equatorial Feeds. And I have to say, not a week goes by that I don't learn of some other little, you know, guy in his garage starting something like this up. So I think that list is going to grow as time goes on. So let's talk about the industry leader, really. I think the consensus is that it is AgroProtein Technologies out of South Africa. Their technology, they process 200 tons a day of organic waste. So for context, by my math, that's about 4 tractor trailers packed to the brim. That's not actually that much, but when you consider how long it takes with soldier flies, they've got about 40 to 50 of these tractor trailers of organic material on site. It starts to add up. And I can tell you that when you've got that much material, especially I believe to some extent they are using human waste, it's a pretty stinky place to work, I bet. The capital cost, yeah, so to do that, they're actually producing something about 20 tons of larvae per day, which they press to extract the oils. And the idea then is that you get a pretty high quality oil out of it, but you also get this defatted insect meal, which is about 55% protein. So you increase the protein content and reduce the fat content. So for a lot of aquaculture species, the initial fat content is just too high. Yeah, actually you can see some of that data on the side there. Again, good source of calcium and phosphorus. So some of the big news for these guys, they were recently named in the global top 100 for clean tech. Yeah, they've partnered recently with Christoph Industries to take their technology and really modernize it. So to get everything engineered soup to nuts. I mean, we're talking about absolutely top-level manufacturing principles applied to these rearing systems. They recently raised $17.5 million to build a second plant in South Africa. And they have plans to build 3 factories in Saudi Arabia. I believe their factory in Hanoi, Vietnam recently came online. So these guys, they're moving and shaking. They're really and they're great communicators too. So if anybody's looking for a job with a great company, I think they're going to be growing fast. I would recommend reaching out to them. I've had conversations with them about licensing technology, and I have only really good things to say about these guys. So I know I already sound like a pitch man. Enviro Flight. So this is a U.S.-based, probably the most advanced company here in the U.S. They were founded in Ohio. Their technology, I assume, is actually quite similar in terms of, conversion of bio-waste into product. But with them, they went the route of getting a patent on their systems, especially for fly breeding. And what that did was basically it put out there to the public that this is how we do it. So, okay, you have to get a license if you want to use that. But on the other hand, if you're trying to up and start your own business, you can take some of the principles from this, which is actually something that we did. We built a mock-up of this and we tested. We saw what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses. I don't particularly love this design. I don't think it's that great, but hey, it's to each their own. Anyway, this company, they recently were acquired by Darling Ingredient, which is a big-time ingredient distributor here in the U.S. And they are attacking sort of exotics markets and things like that. Actually, I'll get into that in the very next slide as to why they're going the route they are. But they're talking about building a very, very large facility in Maysville, Kentucky right now. That was the most recent news out of Enviro Flight. So regulation is the biggest barrier right now for uptake of insects for animal feeds. And it's a bit of a pain in the butt because it's slowing our business down. But on the other hand, I take comfort in knowing that, commercial livestock feeds are fairly tightly regulated. I've seen what happens in areas where you don't have regulation or you don't have enforcement, and you end up with a lot of things like counterfeit feed products. So in Uganda, a really big problem they have there was you might buy a pallet of maize bran to include in your feed. And people will they'll take 20% of that off the top, and then they'll add some, either cheaper ingredient or dirt or something to get the weight back up, but that doesn't actually add nutritional value. That can be a real problem. In fact, people were doing that in Nigeria where they would take fish meal and they would dilute it down with, say, like maize that they would mix a little bit of fish oil in with it to give it that smell and the right consistency. So counterfeit feeds are a big problem. But we are seeing progress in this realm. So for instance, Canada and the US, I believe, have approved use of black soldier fly larvae in salmon feeds. So for farmed salmon, we can now, instead of harvesting fish from the ocean and feeding it to farmed fish, we can actually take food scraps, things like that from our tables, turn it into insects, and then put that onto the farm. You actually also have approval in Canada to grow poultry broilers on soldier flies, which is, I think, kind of great news. But in the meantime, really, if you're starting up a business like us, your focus has to be on specialty feeds. So, for instance, for zoos who have exotic animals that have special dietary requirements, they can and do love to use soldier flies. Live feeders for reptiles, so if anybody has a bearded dragon or something like that, that's quite popular. And backyard poultry treats, there's sort of a treat exemption to some of the regulations there, so you can actually get around and you can sell those. And that's actually what Probyn Farms is, I think, probably the leader in the U.S. right now doing. They've really attacked that market quite effectively, made good partnerships. So that's a bit tough, and that's really been holding us down because in terms of keeping this business going, cash flow is dependent on an investor who just keeps giving us money and money. We're not generating it on our own. So that brings me to the last part, a day in the life. So what does it actually look like if you're trying to develop commercial rearing systems? So again, a lot of these big companies like AgroProtein that are already going are very secretive. To license their technology is very, very expensive. So when we first set out, we said, okay, let's see what it actually takes to develop these systems on our own. And the first thing we did was we built a greenhouse. Terrible idea. Temperature swings in a greenhouse are crazy during the summer. It's very, very cold in the winter. It's just not really a good environment when you need strict environmental controls to mass rear an insect. So what we've done is taken a shipping container and basically turned it into a climate-controlled lab. We've insulated it from the outside. We've got it basically plus or minus 3 degrees of the optimal point. So the black soldier fly, I've mentioned them about 50 times. This is what they kind of look like, and this is their life cycle. So it takes about 44 days in total. And essentially what happens is when they reach this part of their life, they decide to crawl out of their food stock because the process where they're a pupae there is where they go through metamorphosis from a larvae into a into an adult fly. And that takes a long time of inactivity. They're not moving, they're just sitting there. So their tendency is to crawl out of their food when they're ready to go through that. Because let's face it, if the food runs out while they're going through that process, they're going to be on the menu for all their younger brothers and sisters who are trying to, you know, survive and get to that point themselves. So real quick question, are black soldier flies suitable for animal feeds? And this is a study we commissioned down with the University of Georgia's Poultry Science Department, where basically we just had them replace you know, normal, I think it was mainly fish meal, but they replaced the protein source in normal animal and poultry feed with larvae at different inclusion rates. And as you can see, actually in this study, the 12% did better than the control. I'm not going to say that that's universally going to hold, but I do say, you know, kind of what we take away from this is that, yeah, you know, we've got something here. This is a viable alternative. It at least works. So then the next question is, why black soldier flies? The big reason is because they're a low risk for a disease vector. So it's a non-biting fly. The adults are pretty peaceful, actually. You know, you'll have them at our work escape and fly and land all over you. They're really like, they don't eat anything, so it's not like they're usually covered in like poop or anything like that you might find for a housefly. They're pretty ubiquitous. You find them, I think, on most continents. I've heard everyone say that I've heard people say they're on all continents. I'm not sure I totally buy that. I think they've been introduced a lot of places. And they have a relatively fast life cycle. So these are some of the main reasons why they were an attractive organism. In addition, if you look over on the right, we've got some nutritional data. The protein content is good. The sort of fat content is a little bit high, but again, those fats can be useful oils as well. And actually, again, yeah, if you press that out, you can increase the protein content. So our substrates, again, yeah, you've seen at least the photo on the left here before. We're using primarily restaurant scraps. We did do a few trial weeks with crab waste, but I didn't want our entire staff to quit. So we quickly switched back to the restaurant scraps. And I can say that on good days, we get the press cake from a juice bar, which is really great. It smells not so bad at work. On a normal day, it smells like a dumpster that's been sitting in the sun on a hot day. And on a really bad day, we have crab waste and everyone's wearing full face respirators and the smell is ungodly. But you can use all sorts of different organic waste streams as a feedstock. You know, spent brewery grains are a good one. But again, I think I had on a slide earlier, you are what you eat. And the important message there is that like anything else, they kind of have an optimal diet. So you want to give them a well-rounded diet. If you give them just spent brewery grains, they're not going to do very well. So you really need to find the right blend that also doesn't, you know, destroy the substrate in terms of creating souring and other issues. So yeah, when I started out, I thought, how hard can this be? I went to college and didn't take the trash out for weeks and saw what happened. I can grow maggots. This is a sort of DIY system that's fairly popular out there. And this is sort of my impression. I thought it was that easy. You throw the organic waste in, you maybe turn it up every couple of days, and you just harvest the insects that come out. It is not that easy. You know, you can see there's some special things. I can get into this later, but so commercial facilities are usually sort of set up like this. You have your brood stock facility, which is basically just maintaining your colony. You need to have a minimum viable colony with a full life cycle so you can actually produce. And then the idea is that after a sort of incubation period in a nursery, you siphon off a side stream there, and then that becomes your product. So that side stream is what you'll harvest it a little bit early, and you'll, well, I'll actually kind of get into that in the next stage. But yeah, so that's the point. You have to have your colony kind of going around with your broodstock and your larvae production facilities. Pest control protocols, worth mentioning here. Houseflies can get in there and be a real pain in the butt. So we have fly tape all over our place. We had one instance last year where rats got in and actually, like, over the course of a weekend, pretty much wiped out our entire colony. And mites can be a big problem. So biosecurity protocols are really important. Definitely something you can't overlook if you're trying to get into this business. I'm sorry, this is such a really busy slide. I was hoping to make it so that one thing came in at a time, but I did not have time for that. So we'll have to walk through it together. Starting up here, this is what your eggs look like. So that's on the end of a paper clip. They look kind of like rice. They're small. A typical clutch laid by a female is about 350 to 500 eggs. On a really superb, spectacular day, it'll look like that. So that's a piece of, it's a block of cardboard. And as you can see, the white there is just, they've been laying eggs all throughout. So that's a really good day. Most days, you get something a bit more sporadic like that. We've been getting a little bit better at it, so we're seeing more of these days now. But I think this is a great picture for showing that, the adult fly basically tries to lay the eggs in a really tight little space where the risk of predation is minimized. So as the eggs hatch, it takes about 2 to 3 days for them to hatch. They emerge as miniature sort of maggots there. And then, for this period of time, we keep them in an incubator, so they have even a little bit more climate control than they would otherwise. It's really important to keep them fed with the right kind of food. So here we were using wheat bran. It's really just not nutritious enough, so you can see they're all trying to climb up the walls and escape and get out. Again, this can be a really, really critical period in determining, how much product you get out at the end if you don't manage this very well. So you have to take a lot of care, time, and attention. They get a little bit easier as they get to the next stage. So as they get larger, you just keep them in a plastic bin like that. And, you feed them at a fairly steady rate. They'll let you know when they're too hungry or too hot or too sticky or too dry. Usually they'll all rise to the surface, and you'll see a situation like this where they all just try to pour out onto the floor and escape and make your life miserable. Can't tell you how many times I was on weekend duty and I came in to find something like that happening and just wanted to kill whoever was there on Friday. Okay, so next stage, as they're kind of getting older and they've been gorging themselves, they kind of turn from this transparent color to a sort of white color to a yellowish brown. And as you see, right under where it says prepupae, you can see that there's sort of that mound, and 50% or more of them are this dark color. That means they're really kind of getting to the late stage in their life where they're ready to crawl out and go through metamorphosis. And so our systems, when they work effectively, they'll crawl up this little ramp and they'll self-harvest into one of these troughs here. And then these troughs, we collect those every day. We'll weigh what we get. And some of them will be returned into adult fly cages. So again, it'll sometimes, often from there to there, that's one of the toughest things. It takes somewhere between 18 to 20 days for them to complete that process and emerge as flies. And I'm told there's actually sort of a biological component there where there's a stagger between females will hatch a little faster, males hatch a little slower, and I think the idea is actually also to sort of spread out the genetics. So you're not having flies that grew up together in the same litter necessarily reproduce again. You have a slight stagger, so maybe the next generation or slightly different genetics get in the pool. Great question. I'd love to know more about that as well, so maybe we'll hit you up. Your adult fly cages, we're using something like this at this point in time. It's about 2 meters high, 2 feet by 2 feet. In the bottom here, you can see we'll age those prepupae for a couple of weeks just to kind of get the process of pupation going. And also they stop moving, and then we'll stock them in here. And so, every day we'll stock a new tray, and they'll, eventually fly out, and we'll clean the tray out. You have this sort of bucket here with an egg collector in it, and the idea of that bucket is it's got some food in it, so it really stinks, and it makes the adult flies come there to lay their eggs, because ideally for them, they want to make sure that the eggs hatch like right next to the food that they're going to be able to consume. The key here as well is you need nice mating areas, so we have these fake leaves throughout, fake plants that help provide something to get them in the mood. But the key is really lighting, and everybody's really super secretive about the lighting that they use to get the flies to mate. Fluorescents don't work very well. LEDs don't work very well. High-pressure sodiums and metal halides work, but they use a ton of power. We're having a lot of luck with UV for reptiles right now, so I'm willing to share. I think, I don't know. So that's definitely something to consider as well if you need to do artificial lighting. Sunlight is really the best thing, but obviously here in the winter time we don't get a lot of that. So come June we'll be rolling in eggs, I feel like, and doing quite well, but in the winter it can be pretty dismal. The day-to-day tends to look like this. So it's like any other job, you kind of come in, you run through the motions, you check for disasters, clean up, you spray adult fly cages. Again, it's not a set it. I don't want to read every word on this slide. My idea is just to tell you that it's not set it and forget it. This is very much a hands-on. It's like anything you farm. You can't get a bunch of chickens, throw food in, and expect them to just grow. You really need to tend to things. You need to take care of things. You need to make sure biosecurity issues are solved. And so it really is, it's a lot more time and effort that, than we anticipated. And hopefully, you know, we can automate some of these things, but I think there's always going to be a need for some human intervention in a lot of different ways. And then there's your weekly things. You know, you have to make sure your feedstock is coming in. These guys need to eat every day. So if, you know, if your feedstock supplier tells you on Friday, hey, I can't make it today, well, now you're like, oh crap, like what am I going to do Friday, Saturday, Sunday? You've got to have backup plans in place to deal with this. And feedstock doesn't keep very long either. You start to grow molds, that can present problems as well. We've made every mistake in the book, so I encourage you, if you guys are actually interested in that, you can ask me about it later for sure. Yeah, so just some concluding thoughts, I guess. Insects are good for you, and they're good for the environment. Eat them. Try them. Don't be too shy. For me, I started, like I say, with the exo bars. Maybe I'll have, you know, once I get to fried crickets, maybe I'll start with like a burrito or something where I can't see it and then work my way up from there. Culturing BSF is quite tough, but maybe a worthwhile effort. We'll see how it goes. And then, yeah, insects are a nutritious protein supplement for animal feed. So I think this is real. I think this is going to go somewhere. So I thank you very much for spending your lunch with me, and open the floor to any questions.
No, actually, it's for the people online.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you. Really, really interesting. How do you kill the flies?
Oh, good question. Well, so we put them in the freezer. That's been basically the predominant thing. Right now, actually, our stock's pretty low, so we're not doing any killing. We're just recycling everything, trying to build up our densities. But usually, yeah, we'll just throw them in the freezer for about 24 hours, and then we'll put them in the dryer from there if we're gonna sell them for feed or something like that.
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering, you showed how they compare a bit to other forms of like animal protein. I was wondering how they compare to like plant-based protein, and do plant-based proteins ever get into animal feed typically, or?
Good question. I'm not an expert, but definitely there are animal protein, plant proteins, in there, like, well, cottonseed cake, for instance. Also, you know, soy cake is a really big one. So there are plant-based proteins. I think that there are certain amino acids, particularly lysines, the one that jumps out to me, that I think are not, you know, as easy to get in in plant proteins. But yeah, there's also some talk about algae. A lot of folks are interested in duckweed and algae potentially making their way into animal feed. So I think there's potential there, and there are some already, particularly in places like Uganda. All sorts of things, anything that has any nutritional value, sweet potato leaves, they find their way into feeds there all the time.
Hi, I don't have a question, just two tips. First, thanking you for coming today. I work upstairs with the Talwar Network, and we are a global coalition of universities that focus on youth entrepreneurship and civic engagement. One of our student-led entrepreneurial programs that has gotten the most recognition and awards is actually they make food out of caterpillars in Burkina Faso. So I encourage you to check them out. They're Faso Pro, and they were recognized by the World Bank, among others. And for the audience here who might be curious about this cuisine, you only need to walk down to Powderhouse Square and at Tuyo restaurant. You could get the tacos de chapulín if you want to know what cricket tacos are all about. It's only a 5-minute walk away.
Thank you.
Sorry if I missed this, but I was just wondering, what's your client base at this point? Like, what are you doing with most of what you produce?
Great question. Yeah, right now it's really backyard chickens, you know, and I haven't put a lot of emphasis on sales because our production is so low that it wouldn't even make a dent. I think it would actually divert our resources. I think our resources are spent better elsewhere. But, you know, we have some local folks who are growing backyard chickens, and we'll match the lowest price they can find online and give them to them. But otherwise, we haven't really made a concerted effort. That's sort of the next phase, actually, is once we get our population up to where we think we can at this point based on capacity, we'll go after reptiles, backyard chickens, just the things that we're allowed to right now. You know, the problem is they're low volume markets. So, the margins are good, but we just can't really sell that much. Live feeders is good too, but of course there's a lot of spoilage there. So that's something we're interested in, but haven't gotten there yet.
It seems to me the beauty of this thing is that these are eating machines. At the point that you're harvesting it, there's no other distractions. That's what caterpillars, that's what fly larvae do. They just eat. So you get a lot of bang for your buck. And I'm kind of curious as to what you think, how long, if you were to start something like this up, you're obviously not yet making a profit. How long did it take agribusiness? I mean, so what is the time frame if someone's going to get into this area? How long does it take to build something that actually becomes profitable? Do you have a sense?
And I'll tell you when I find out. But in the meantime, I think it's going to take quite a while. I mean, AgroProtein has raised a bunch of money. I'm not sure. They claim that after about 18 months, one of their factories starts to become cash flow positive. So, so if anyone's got, $17 million kicking around and you're looking to do something good for the world with that, you can buy one of those. And then I don't know what the long-term prospects look like, but yeah, but it's interesting. I mean, I think certainly for us, it's going to be, our model is more of develop a system that's repeatable and photocopy it 1,000 times and then it'll start to pay off. I don't think that in our facility in Falmouth we'll ever get to profitability.
So could you tell us a little bit about how you decided to dive into this?
I needed a job. Yeah, so I was always really interested in waste to, looking at waste as a resource. That really kind of guided a lot of my studies, actually. So grad school, I went to Ghent University to do environmental technology, specifically to look at, like, okay, well, how do we change the form of different waste streams? How do we turn it into something that's usable? And so, after business school, I was looking for the right job. I didn't want to just sort of sign on with a Bank of America or HP or any of the other companies that were hiring a lot of my colleagues. I wanted to do something like this. And it took about 8 months for me to find this gig. I was just working, other jobs in the meantime, trying to find the right opportunity. So this one came along, and I've been at it for 18 months. It's been, like I said, challenging. Every time I think I've got these bugs figured out, I come up with an invention or something. I'm like, this is